Salutations, loyal viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So I'm doing a request. Someone asked me to produce a video about Afro Caribbean immigration into the United Kingdom. Perhaps I should have phrased it differently because I had a black classmate once, and her ancestors had moved from the Caribbean not so long ago, and she took exception to the word Afro Caribbean, saying Afro is a hairstyle. You could say African Caribbean or Black Caribbean. So forgive me if that was a lapsus linguae. Anyway, so the United Kingdom has a history of treating black people abominably, particularly those of West African origin. That's before the UK as such existed. Remember, the United Kingdom only came into being in 1707. But if you look at the constituent countries, if you will, of the UK, England and Wales, to a less extent Ireland and Scotland, that's true. So going back to the 16th century, that's when parts of the British Isles first came into contact with people in West Africa. And Elizabeth I authorized Jack Hawkins to sail to West Africa and abduct people. Now, there were many different nations in West Africa, often at war against each other. And when one monarch defeated a rival realm, those who were defeated were often taken prisoner, and then these luckless captives were sometimes forced into servitude. The same had pertained in Europe and other zones of the globe. So people from one African country would sometimes sell men and women of their race to these European sailors or pirates, might be a more apposite description. English and Welsh ones, occasionally, say Spaniards, Portuguese, Ottoman Turks, but all that would be more North Africa. Anywhere else, French sailors and so forth. And these unfortunate people were then forced onto ships in chains. Some of them were simply murdered out of hand if they weren't thought to be physically fit, and then had no idea where they're going, often come from hundreds of miles inland and never seen the littoral in many cases, didn't know what a ship was, and had no common language of the people who'd kidnapped them. And you can imagine how petrified they would be. I mean, put yourself in this position. I think probably a useful exercise for whites to have a film made of black people doing that to whites. And maybe some whites would start to appreciate the full horror of this. Oh my God, what's happened? Where am I going? Am I going to be eaten alive? I'm going to be killed and taken across on a voyage. Had no idea how long it was going to be. Chained up under the hold in the dark. And obviously nowhere to urinate or defecate. So just so insanitary. And many people died on the voyage. And their limp corpses simply thrown overboard. Anyway, so finally, after at least 6 weeks, they'd crossed the Atlantic. This is part of the triangular trade, and forced into servitude in the Antilles or in continental America. So these people had been traded for various trinkets, shells occasionally, gems, mirrors, things that West Africa didn't produce, alcohol, guns, whatever else, various types of cloth. So it was a sort of a barter economy, occasionally sort of gold or silver or Maria Theresa's. And I had this sort of painted glass beads that people were traded for, and it stood in as currency in West Africa. And often chieftains were buried in these things, and they completely rotted away. But centuries later, they might be found. And so some people believe that these beads grew in the ground. Yeah, 1619 was the first time people were taken as cargo and their own from West Africa to North America. Previously been somewhat the Caribbean islands, and these hapless people were obviously treated abominably, often lashed, given a crash course in England, and made to toil dawn till dusk for just starvation rations, and that was that. So there was never a self-sustaining slave population. I don't like to call people slaves. It seems very demeaning. We say victims of slavery, but that's more of a mouthful. And so and that went on, as we know, in the American continent for some form until, in 1863 in the United States, in Brazil and Cuba even longer. Anyway, so from the 17th century, some people in England in particular had become very wealthy through the trade in Homo sapiens. And so in Bristol, Liverpool, and London, to a lesser extent, Newcastle, so there were some very affluent men, and they often got into Parliament, became a very potent pro-slavery lobby. Now, the Catholic Church had denounced slavery for centuries, but the Protestant churches didn't, except for the Quakers. But it really wasn't a live issue in politics. There was too much of a vested interest of some very wealthy men in maintaining the status quo. But some of those who held their fellow humans in chattel slavery brought these people of African descent to the British Isles, particularly to London, to a lesser extent the other major port cities. So the people of West African stock residing in what then became the United Kingdom from the late 17th century in tiny, tiny numbers. Okay, by then the population of England and Wales might have been 4 million, and there's been a handful of black people. Anyway, so the United Kingdom was as such was formed in 1707, but prior to that, England and Wales had owned, well, obviously the eastern coast of what's now the United States, the 13 colonies as it became, various islands in the Caribbean. Now they were tussling with other European maritime powers, such as the Netherlands, France, and Spain for islands, but Trinidad and Tobago fell into the British lap. Obviously, they got a Spanish name, Trinidad, as in Trinity, and the capital being Port of Spain, or likewise Jamaica. And the Spanish, when they realized they're going to be defeated by the British, or at least the people they'd held in captivity, these people, Marranos, or Maroons, is it Cimarron, comes from a Spanish word, means something like wild. And so they regained their freedom, and they held out in the fastness of the forests, and the British Army could never defeat them as they valiantly fought to maintain their liberty. So Spanish Town being the historic capital of Jamaica, then shifted to Kingston. I'm one of us named after Kingston upon Thames. Grenada, likewise, the British Virgin Islands, Antigua, Barbados, and St. Lucia, the Bahamas, originally Spanish, of course, that's where Christopher Columbus came ashore. Bajamar, as in shallow sea, St. Kitts and Nevis, Dominica, not to be confused with the Dominican Republic, and there may be a few others which I've forgotten to mention. Montserrat. So I mean, some of our own people, Irish people, had been enslaved under Cromwell and shipped to the West Indies, particularly Barbados and Montserrat, which is why the Irish accent prevails there to this day. So the thing about this slavery was had a racist rationale, saying unacceptable to enslave whites, but it was permissible to enslave black people. Whites, like an island, some of us enslaved. If we'd rebelled against the Lord Protector Cromwell, we were actually being faithful to our king, Charles I, and then Charles II. But the slavery for whites was only temporary, was for several years, or up to 14 years, or indentured servitude, being an indentured servant, which was very bad, but not as bad for slavery, and it wasn't heritable. So it was colour prejudice behind it, and that's why they came up with this legal doctrine that the child shall in all cases follow the condition of the mother. I can't remember what that Latin word is for womb, as in to follow the womb, because these whites who owned other humans, these people, sometimes they had intercourse with the black women. Now, I think we'd have to categorize it as rape, even if it was somewhat consensual, because this woman was in no position to refuse his overtures, because he had power of life over death over her, literally. Could whip her, could cut off her toes or something like that, could do terrible things to her family, sell her children to another plantation owner, and blah, blah, blah. So he could kill her, and he'd definitely get away with it. So she couldn't turn him down. Anyway, so children were born as a consequence of these liaisons, and the progeny of these encounters being mixed race, they were still held in slavery. And there was this one drop rule: even if someone was 3/4 white and then a quarter black, such a person was still held in slavery, often called a mulatto if a man, and a mulatta if a woman, and so forth. And the various other gradations of that. So there was a vicious colour bigotry and terrible brutality, this utterly satanic system. And some of these whites who were so demonic towards people of African blood seemed to feel guiltless about this, and said it was biblically sanctioned under Genesis chapter 9. Well, I won't go into that, but I'm going to talk about black people in the British Isles. So there were black people in the British Isles from the late 16th century. Obviously, you go back to ancient Roman times, people from North Africa, but I was asked to talk about Afro Caribbean people. And so they were in London. It became very fashionable for very wealthy families to own a black person there. Overwhelmingly, there were males who brought there, and they made their way into some oil paintings. person was treated as a curiosity, an object of fascination. Laura Equiano was a notable black person in London in the late 18th century who gained his liberty, who'd been a man of high status in Africa before he'd fallen captive. And he later wrote a book about his ghastly experiences. The anti-slavery movement was getting going, spreading beyond the religious society of Friends. Then there was the celebrated Somerset case. James Somerset was found in London eating lunch in a pub, and he had a severely bruised face, and a man asked him what was the matter, what happened to him. He'd been very badly beaten up by his master. So there was a legal tussle over this, a court case, and it was heard by Lord Mansfield, that Scots jurist. And I know it's gone down in history as the air of England is too sweet for a slave to breathe, but that's not true. He used the rather less sonorous words which would grate upon modern ears. The black must be discharged. Those being the final words of the case. So Mr. Somerset was free. He had his rights. He couldn't simply be held in slavery. So though slavery was permissible in the colonies, there was no tradition of slavery in England or Wales, because there had been, but the Normans had abolished it. So although people could be kidnapped from other countries or held in thraldom overseas, once such a person came to England or Wales, he or she immediately regained his or her rights. So it was a curious anomaly. If slavery is unacceptable in England and Wales, why should there be acceptance of it in the lands that were subservient to England and Wales and were to follow English law? Anyway, so by the late 18th century, up to 3% of London's population was black. Now, that would be the highest concentration of black people in the British Isles by quite some way. There might have been whole counties in which there wasn't a single black person. And many of these black people might have been had mixture of ethnicity, being half or only a quarter black. And even people from India might then have been classified as black. When I say India, of course, they in some cases came from Bangladesh, not very much Pakistan. The British had only got to what's now Pakistan in the mid 19th century. So some of the other major port cities, they also had black communities. So it was intermarriage. Overwhelmingly, it was black males arrived. These men, they married white females. Their children were half black. The grandchildren were only a quarter black, and the great-grandchildren only 1/8 black, by which time they tended to just blend into the white community, although sometimes that black gene was expressed as a phenotype several generations down the line, leading to people wonder whether there had been some infidelity. So they often came as sailors or just as personal servants. And there was one case of a black man who was a teacher in the mid-19th century, but he faced racial discrimination, and some reporting him said he would be a very able teacher except for his colour, because there was so much colour prejudice at the time. So there was a lot of vicious bigotry, just as there was terrible sadism on the plantations, people working under the lash, and slave rebellions, and such cruel ways of murdering people who fought for their liberty. So Christian Cole is a very notable person of black stock from West Africa in this country in the 1880s. He came from Sierra Leone. Now, he was a Christian indeed, as his name might indicate. I believe he was a Creole. That's to say, his ancestors have been kidnapped from West Africa, taken to the New World, and then manumitted. Once they had their freedom, there was an idea of bringing some of these black people back to their original continent, but often they didn't know where they'd come from because they come from deep inland, usually it's a few generations later, and you couldn't trace it to a modern country or couldn't find it geographically, had never seen a map. So if your grandmother come from Guinea-Bissau and your grandfather from Nigeria, and the other side, the other grandfather from Cameroon, and the other grandmother from Benin, well, where were they going to send you? And they might have been from hundreds of miles inland as well. But anyway, so some of these black people of the Caribbean were sent back to their ancestral continent, and at Sierra Leone, a British colony, I know it's got a Spanish name, Lion Mountain. The Spaniards had named it that centuries before, despite not having settled there. But Freetown was the capital, as in these people who had been set at liberty were to settle there. The French had the same idea with Gabon, Libreville, meaning just Freetown, or the Americans with Liberia, as in Liberty, and Monroeville, in honor of President James Monroe, was founded in 1822. So Creole people in Sierra Leone were those whose ancestors had lived in the New World for at least a generation and then returned to the old country. Though it wasn't usually precisely Sierra Leone they came from, and they formed this Anglophone coastal elite, just like the Libero-Americans as in the Liberians whose families had lived in the United States for some time before returning to Africa. Yeah, increasingly sailors came, and there were tiny black communities in various port cities like Cardiff, and they faced some racial prejudice. So people might imagine that there were no black people or people from the Caribbean in particular till the 1940s, but that's not the case. They've been in this country for, let me see, over 300 years. Tiny numbers at first. I know they're now quite significant numbers. The First World War, the Royal West India Regiment was raised. The West Indies being the Caribbean, but it was called the West India Regiment, not West Indies. I suppose the East Indies, which would be India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, could also mean even Singapore, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia, Myanmar. So some of these men served on the Western Front, and I think it was I always get them confused. The Manly father, is it Michael Manley, not Norman Manley, was served in the British Army in the First World War. Charlie Williams, the celebrated Yorkshire comedian, his father was in this Royal West India Regiment. Charlie Williams, who died about 20 years ago now. There was also a mayor of Battersea, that's a borough of London, and just before the First World War, who was a black man of Caribbean stock. There was a renowned boxer, Joe Johnson. So Rhodes Scholarships opened in 1900, and some black people from the Caribbean came to Oxford University courtesy of Cecil John Rhodes. I know he's a figure with a very contentious reputation these days. Ricky Tomlinson, you might know him, the Scouse comedian and actor, and his grandfather was partly black, and Ricky Tomlinson didn't really know the story there. So Ricky Tomlinson is like 1/8 black or something like that. And in Liverpool, that was not unusual. Or I take Shirley Bassey, Dame Shirley Bassey from Tigers Bay, the most racially mixed area of Cardiff. There are probably more black people in Tigers Bay than the whole of the rest of Wales. But she's Nigerian, not actually only Caribbean stock on her father's side. Leary Constantine had come to this country in the 1930s, and people from the University of the West Indies went on to further study in the United Kingdom, or qualifying as doctors and things, being called to the Bar of England and Wales, which meant if they returned to the Antilles, they were entitled to practice at the bar there. So Leary Constantine, that superb cricketer, was there, called to the bar. He's I think a Trinidadian, a man to be held in very high regard. And outrageously, though he booked a night in a hotel, he was refused his hotel room on the grounds of colour, and it went to court. But the judge ruled that there was no law against that. Even the judge felt terribly sorry for Mr. Constantine, or Constantine, I believe it was pronounced, who'd suffered this indignity and just the sheer inconvenience of not having a place to stay. The judge couldn't simply invent a law. And so racial discrimination was entirely lawful in the 1940s. And we'll come to this when I talk about the Windrush generation a bit more. And so there were some black nurses there in the United Kingdom. So the Royal Air Force had people from the Caribbean, black people almost without exception. And so they were battling to save the United Kingdom. So obviously the UK owes them an immense debt of gratitude for their gallantry. But it's quite scandalous the way some were mistreated after the Second World War. It's nauseating and deeply shameful. There was this malaise of racialism. So racist attitudes, I'm sorry to say, were actually quite widespread. And in some cases, mild or moronic or whatever, patronizing. In other cases, absolutely vicious. So there was Lord Pitt, who was a doctor, and he practiced in London for many years, mostly in Brixton. He was the first black person to become a peer of the realm. And then he encouraged the police to do more to engage with the black Caribbean community and people from that community to join the police. And when the first black man became a police officer in the 1970s, it was front page news, and the BBC led with it. So Lord Pitt said that, of course, he was denounced as a race traitor by some radical black nationalists, said it was Uncle Tom, and some whites, particularly of the old school, said that he was a dangerous agitator. Okay, so the seminal moment is 1948. That, I think was it July, when the SS Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury, a ship from Jamaica been used, I think, as a troop ship in the Second World War, carried over 400 people from the Caribbean, black people, almost all of them, most of them men, to England. And there were some Polish women on it as well. And so when it was clear that this ship was coming over, there was consternation, there was rising panic in Downing Street in the capital. What are we going to do? And someone wrote, was it civil servant, well, one winter will see them out. They just won't be able to cope with the cold. Now, of these men, a third of them had previously served in the British Armed Forces, so they were quite aware of what the temperature was. And yes, it's chilly compared to the climate of the West Indies, but there's such a thing as a coat. And they could get better wages. Often they were invited. They'd seen adverts for jobs. There was a severe labour shortage in the United Kingdom after the Second World War. So much reconstruction was needed. And there was a net emigration, more people going out than coming in, moving to Australia, New Zealand, the United States, South Africa. Now, that same year that roughly 500 black people from the West Indies moved to the UK, there must have been tens of thousands of people from the Republic of Ireland coming over. And nobody seemed to raise an objection to us. That there was hybernophobia, it was mild. That there was anti-Catholicism, it was trifling in most areas. Liverpool and Glasgow a bit more serious. And it was only the next year, the Republic of Ireland, well, we declared the Republic, we left the Commonwealth, giving two fingers to England again. And despite that, we were given the unique privilege of being allowed to settle, work, and vote in the United Kingdom without filling out a single form. Now, these black people from the Caribbean, they were still in British colonies and still, in some regards, times regarded the United Kingdom as the mother country, even though most of them had no ancestors from the United Kingdom, brought up to exalt it, this cargo cult version of Britishness, to admire it, thinking it was like the most civilized and humane country in the world. Was then they were rapidly disabused of the idea that the Brits were all gentlemen, only ever seen whites in authority positions. So anyway, these men, there was such a shortage of accommodation, they were housed in a form of bomb shelter on Clapham Common. I think I know the one. I should film outside it actually. And so the nearest labour exchange, as I went to find a job, we now call it a job centre, was a Cold Harbour Lane in Brixton. They could walk about a mile to that. So they did. And then Brixton became the heart of the black community in the United Kingdom. There are some streets there in which the majority of people are black. Brixton, even today, probably the black people are a minority of people, depending how broadly define Brixton, might be like 40% black. Not to say that all the others are whites. There are a few South Asians and East Asians, and the whites, to say, often like Polish or Italian and so forth. So there's Electric Avenue, features in a famous Caribbean song around there. That's that. So the Commonwealth was still going. They were gaining greater self-governance through the 60s and the 70s. These Caribbean colonies, they became independent states, mostly Commonwealth states. Though Trinidad rapidly declared a republic, and there are a few of them like Montserrat, or I can't remember, the British Virgin Islands, which are still crown dependencies. So there were race riots in the 1950s. So some of the black people, they faced terrible discrimination, difficulty getting housing, signs up at the window, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. I do think the no Irish ones were very, very rare indeed. I've only ever met one person who ever recalled seeing them, and I might have only seen one. So I think we can't feel too sorry for ourselves. We mustn't, not such a plangent history for us. And because lose the accent and we're just indistinguishable from a Welshman, a Scot, or an Englishman. Anyway, so some of these people were terribly treated despite very honourable wartime service. And so they had difficulty finding places to stay. They were having to look at rent rooms. You can forget about renting a whole house in most cases, much less getting a mortgage. So often having to pay over the odds for substandard accommodation. So rack renters could rip them off. And so some of them moved to Notting Hill. It's now a very she area, but back then it was very down at heel, very raffish and decrepit. So having to stay in these real rat traps of houses, these rookeries, which have been mid-19th century upper middle class houses, by 1948 were often falling apart in such a parlour state. Despite the dilapidation, these people had no alternative and were paying through the nose for several adults to share a bedroom. Peter Rackman, a recent immigrant from Poland, and he was making money out of this. But people say, well, there's prejudice against him just because he's a Pole, because I think he was Jewish. as opposed to his guy with impeccable establishment credentials, an Englishman, an old Etonian, who was his business partner, and very seldom was he rapped over the knuckles for exploiting desperate people. So and some of these black people were set upon and beaten up by teddy boys. And then there's a plaque to one of them near the Trevithick Tower. Trevithick Tower. I can't remember the guy's name. Poor man murdered in the 1950s. A young man, completely unoffending, set upon and murdered by white youths. And I don't think any of these youngsters were convicted for their heinous and completely unprovoked attack. Sort of at early days, Stephen Lawrence and the League of Empire Loyalists was formed. But if you believe in the empire, as I do, you should support racial intermingling and living cheek by jowl and borrowing from other people's cultures, learning from them, embracing them. That's my sort of imperialism. You might think it naive. And if these are going to be colonies, they have the absolute right to live in the United Kingdom, just as Britishers have the right to live in the colonies or the dominions. And so Oswald Mosley, who ironically had emigrated to the Republic of Ireland and latterly France, came back to say that nobody should immigrate into his country, though he had immigrated into two other ones, and appealing to the basest racial prejudice and saying, oh, they don't want to be here and we don't pay them enough for their products, so they're coming here and we should have jobs for own people. Despite there being a labour shortage, unemployment was very, very low. It was about 2%. So he appealed to the lowest common denominator and he stood in the Kensington North by-election, I think in 1959, but lost, got almost 10% of the vote. So that was his last foray into politics, preaching a gospel of racial animus. Thankfully, he was put to flight and disgraced. But Max Mosley, his son, campaigned to him, didn't stop Labour taking money from him much later. Max Mosley putting out leaflets saying, these people are at risk to your child's health. Well, did these men on women have communicable diseases at a high rate? I'm not sure that they did. But even if they did, there was no rule to say that they shouldn't be allowed to come to the UK or they should be cured then. And white Britons can have these illnesses too. Anyway, so finally in the 60s, some anti-discrimination legislation was passed, the Race Relations Act, and then in the 70s, the Labour in both cases. But there was blind panic from some about this, and so the right to immigrate to the UK was restricted in the 60s and much more in the 70s. Claudia Jones came from one of the Caribbean countries, I forget which, had lived in the United States for years, even though she's a woman with no tertiary education. She was, well, as an autodidact, she achieved a great deal. So she was a very erudite woman and wrote some very cerebral and impressive articles. She was a communist and a tireless campaigner against racial hatred and exploitation. And she moved to the United Kingdom. She helped to organise the Notting Hill Festival, Notting Hill Carnival, because black people had been ill-used in this country. So she said, well, let's fight back in a positive way and let's celebrate all that is fantastic about our culture, and a great way to introduce whites to what's positive about being a black person from the Antilles, and just have a feel good time. And it started something really tiny in a church hall, but is now huge, the largest celebration of black culture outside of Africa. Every August bank holiday. It's the last weekend of August. The Monday is a day off as well, and that's when it takes place. Notting Hill, that area of London. You may have seen the Hugh Grant film from 1999, Notting Hill, is that area of London, which is now a very affluent and exclusive area of London. So people from all over London, all over the UK, abroad, even France, come specifically for that. Some of these are the people, Londoners, would never go to Notting Hill the rest of the year. But for some people, that really is the pinnacle of their year. People walking on stilts and going by in floats and their samba dancers and so on, or drinking red stripe and eating jerk chicken and mountain chicken, that's a toad, or curried goat, and whatever else it is. I'm not saying I like all these things, but anyway, it's on offer for those of you who want it. And obviously anyone can go. There are no tickets to go, and it's a street party. So unfortunately, in the 90s, it had a fairly bad reputation. There was a bit of crime around it. There's very little of that now. The police have got a much better handle on it. But they always have to prioritise and just ignore people smoking cannabis. There's only a few people do. What was I going to say? So Leary Constantine was later. He was High Commissioner for his country in the UK. But he seemed to sort of blend that role of being a politician as well, and intervening perhaps too vehemently on an issue where black people were being discriminated against Was he right to do so? Maybe he was. He had to be an advocate for them. Very few British politicians would have the guts or the moral decency to speak up for these people. Therefore, he had to act in furtherance of his compatriots in the UK. Obviously, after 5 years, he could become a British citizen. So hundreds of thousands of black people from the Caribbean moved to the United Kingdom in the 1950s and the 1960s and have come since. Yeah, Enoch Powell in 1968, that March, no, sorry, that April, he gave his notorious Rivers of Blood speech, like the Roman, I'm filled with foreboding, I see the Tiber foaming with much blood, against Commonwealth immigration generally. He had no objection to us coming from the Republic of Ireland. So that was that. And someone said, but as an Englishman, how come you don't object to a Scot, but you do object to someone from Barbados or Trinidad, saying, oh, well, they're subjects of the same queen. People from Trinidad or Jamaica or the Bahamas were also subjects of the same queen, you ignoramus. Saying this immigration has brought about changes quite unprecedented in 1,000 years of English history. Well, he obviously hasn't heard of the Norman Conquest then. But did colonization not bring about changes unprecedented in 1,000 years of, say, West African history? Yes, of course it did, enormously. Or in Jamaican history? Yeah, hugely. Now, but Powell's logic was this: the British Empire is over. That's it. So no more preferential immigration. If these people want to remain colonies, that'd be different. But they don't. So it's over. He said he wasn't against immigration per se, including of black people, but it had to be very, very low levels. And he had no hang up about interracial marriage, which was perhaps surprising, given that quite a lot of people in the 60s did. They did an opinion poll, and I think the majority of people would object to their daughter marrying a black man, quite shockingly. Anyway, so the Immigration Act changed it all, and in the early 70s it was decided that those who'd already come from these Caribbean countries to the United Kingdom would be allowed to stay. That was it. But it became a lot more difficult if you didn't have at least one grandparent born in the United Kingdom. It wasn't officially colour discrimination. If it just so happened that you're a black person who had one grandparent born in the UK, you could come. But in almost every case, this allowed white Commonwealth people from, say, Australia to come, but not people from other Commonwealth countries, as in the new Commonwealth or the non-white Commonwealth. So Lenny Henry, he was, I think, born in the United Kingdom in Dudley to parents who moved over from Jamaica. Later in the 70s, he started the black and white minstrel show, which continued into the 80s. He says he now rues doing that, but there are very few opportunities for him to appear on telly, and he was contractually obliged to do so. That it was playing to the basest anti-black stereotypes and depicting black people as half-wits, so it was deeply unpalatable. But anyway, it was both an advantage and disadvantage in being a young black comic in the 70s. One thing, everybody knew who he was, instantly recognizable. On the other hand, there was racial prejudice against him. But obviously, black people from the Caribbean or of Caribbean ancestry have been in the United Kingdom in serious numbers for quite some time now, for over 70 years. So they're part of the furniture, and almost nobody wants them to leave. And obviously they're British citizens in the great majority of cases. But it went wrong with this sort of Windrush scandalous hostile environment idea, and some people who were British citizens were deported. And now they've been brought back since. At the first, I didn't believe it. I thought this kind of thing simply isn't possible. But it happened. So I was horrified. And we're quite a well-integrated community because obviously come here speaking English. If they have any religion at all, it's Christian. Okay, if you're Rastafari, okay, some were converted to other religions. Now, it's not that important. And obviously, Muslims and Hindus and so forth and Jews have absolute right to be in the UK. But if you happen to belong to the majority religion, it just makes life even easier. You're going to know what Christmas is, for example. And had the same monarch, and governmental institutions would all be familiar and tend to be quite into the same sports like football or whatever. Even the toponyms in the West Indies are often copied from places over here, various counties and towns in the British Isles. And even the names, Christian names and surnames would be the same. And that was a thing from the name on the list, you couldn't tell a person's ethnicity. But sometimes somebody phoned up and applied for a job, and if the white, and it usually was a white on the other end, heard a West Indian accent say, oh, the position's been filled, put the phone down and discriminate against people, which is why this anti-discrimination legislation had to be introduced. So I think the Black Caribbean community is more prosperous than it was, and very happily mixed in with the white community, and that's why interracial relations are very, very common They looked at black men and black women of Caribbean ancestry, and loads, I think it's a majority, have a spouse, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, or who's white. That's that. So there doesn't seem to be any hang up about interracial relationships there. So yeah, people at Cambridge University, they're very concerned. There are very few black Caribbean male undergraduates, plenty of black Caribbean female undergraduates. Why? And that's different from people who are black African, as in come directly from Africa, as in their parents moved from Ghana, born in the UK, or indeed living in Kenya right now, and then applied to Cambridge and studying at Cambridge. That's different with no Caribbean side. Why is it considerably lower amongst men than amongst women? I'm not quite sure. I shan't go into it. So that's where the Black Caribbean community is now. Supplied several politicians, unfortunately, mostly for Labour, and all sorts of, well, novelists and what else can I say? Sports stars, Olympians, footballers contributed in so many fields in the police, the civil service, in the armed forces. So there was this national service of thanksgiving at Westminster Abbey to thank the Almighty for persuading people from the Caribbean to move to the United Kingdom and become British citizens. But I think the community is increasingly confident of its position, having been in the UK in significant numbers for 70 something odd years, and not going away, only going to increase in number. Not so many coming over, but many people are here having a higher than average fertility rate and mixing in, and that's splendid. So there we are. That's my very brief history of Black Caribbean people in the British Isles. Make sure you subscribe.